Okay, good morning. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the National Security Forum in our new venue and our new format. We welcome everybody back. For those of you who don't know me, I am Maureen McCarthy. I am the Program Director for NSF. We're doing this series of programs in honor of our country's 250th. And what that means is, as we look forward, we're going to be looking back in history. We're going to try and put the national security issues that are really important to us and the country in the context of what's happened in the past. And so with that, you're going to hear the laydown of the national security strategy, but not just what it looks like now, but how it looks in context to previous strategies and what it means. How do we get to this point? America first, again. Yeah. So what does this mean? And for those of you who are curious about that lovely eagle picture, thank you for asking. I took this picture last week as I was on my way down to the airport. It is a gorgeous bald eagle on the fields on the Flathead Reservation in Northwest Montana. There were about 30 of them out there. I thought it's a good omen for this program. Our speakers today, you know well, Keith Hansen and Ray Huffstutler. They are our expert contributors. They have done this type of program several times, and they have a lot of information to give you. But before we get started with them, I am going to give just the highest level summary on what this national security strategy, how to think about it. Then Keith is going to move into a little bit of compare and contrast, how it's the same and different from previous strategies. And then Ray is going to go into the meat of the discussion about what the strategy actually has. And then we're going to circle back with some closing thoughts and address your questions. So be thinking about the topics that are really important to you. Thinking about this strategy, this is really a substantially different document than we've seen, but there are some things that I think on a high level, and to that end, there are cheat sheets on the table. So those cheat sheets, and if you didn't get one, you're welcome to let us know. We'll make sure we'll get you one. And we will post this as a PDF on the website under this program. This is just a short summary of what's in the strategy. Think about these strategies not so much as policy prescriptive, but they're really aspirational, and in this case, transitional, moving our mindset to a new world. So the biggest takeaway probably of anything on this strategy is the shift in mindset from the rules-based, global rules-based organizational focus to sovereign nations rule, which is essentially much more focus on the individual sovereign nation, less on the rules-based organizations that have been driving actions across the globe for the last 80 years. Also, the big idea is the return to this concept of spheres of influence and the notion that the big guys in the room, of which we're one of them, maybe the biggest, are looking to have that control over what we used to call near abroad, and we're calling near abroad again. And don't think of this as, oh my gosh, this all changed in the last year. This is a progression of ideas and mindsets that have been going on for probably 30 years globally. And so you're seeing the culmination, and what you're seeing is probably the first time it's really been put in print. So I'm going to turn to Keith to give us a little bit of ideas about what's the same from previous strategies and what's different.
Thank you, Maureen. This is the document. If you haven't looked at it, I would recommend that you do so. It's not terribly deep, but it does give you a sense of where this administration wants to go. This is really more of a campaign speech than it is a policy prescription. In fact, Ray and I were wondering, who actually wrote this thing? You know, is this a speechwriter for the president, or are there people in the National Security Council who are actually putting pen to paper or fingers to keyboards to make it happen? We're not really sure. Let me just get on with sort of the nuts and bolts to help you get more oriented, particularly if you haven't had the opportunity to look into it. What's the same? Well, mom and apple pie. All right. Ensure U.S. sovereignty, safety, and prosperity. Now, what president's not going to say that? Strengthen U.S. military capabilities and modernization of conventional and nuclear forces. That's a fairly consistent link with previous administrations and previous statements of strategy. But there are significant shifts in priorities and the agenda of this administration. Let me just hit a couple of these and see if they make sense to you. Peacemaking and prevent regional conflicts from becoming major wars. Now, that may not seem to be too different, but the way this administration is going about it is strikingly different. Emphasize economic vice military competition. And emphasize presidential diplomacy. One has to say, where is the Department of State in all this? Where is the National Security Advisor? It seems to be a one-man stand. The president's out there being the chief diplomat and trying to bring about change. Okay, prioritizing the defense of our homeland through preeminence in the Western Hemisphere. Now, that's a significant shift. When was the last time an administration really focused much on Latin America? When you think back to the Cuban Missile Crisis in Central America during the Reagan administration, a lot of focus on specific areas. But this seems to be a more global approach. And what's the objective? It's to counter mass migration, drug trafficking, and foreign incursions. Read China, principally. But it also has competition with China in the Indo-Pac region. That term is now big out there, Indo-Pac. That's a big piece of turf. And it involves protecting the free passage of trade through the South China Sea, which may lead to conflict if we're not careful with China. But it also emphasizes deterring conflict over Taiwan. Sort of, China's going to get it sooner or later. Let's not spill blood over it. Let it happen like we did with Hong Kong. There fundamentally is no mention of North Korea. Now, in the previous administration under Trump, that was a big deal. And this document is silent. What happened to North Korea? Well, we know they're continuing to build up their nuclear forces and so on. So it hasn't gone away. But what about it? The emphasizing competition with China and Russia in the Middle East and Africa. So a shift away from the areas of the world which have predominantly focused our attention to the Western Hemisphere. And downplay the Russian threat to Europe. Now that kind of wakes you up, doesn't it? What are we in the middle of? A 4-year war in Ukraine? That NATO has, with fits and starts, been trying to support the existence of Ukraine against Russian incursion. But the idea here is to enable NATO to take care of its own backyard. Well, we'll see how that works out. And there's no mention in this document about what do we want the end result to be for Ukraine. I was thinking that driving down here this morning. You know, think of Ronald Reagan in the 80s talking about the evil empire and so on, and we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to do that to block them. And this administration seems to be silent. And there's no mention of what is the U.S. going to do about its Article 5 commitment to NATO. Remember that Article 5 is attack against one, attack against all. No mention of that. Very interesting. Maybe even troubling. Now, another big difference in this document is it was not accompanied by a national defense strategy or a nuclear weapon review. If you remember when Ray and I spoke a couple years ago, how long has it been now? The beginning of the previous administration, all three documents kind of came out, boom, you know, like a shotgun. But what's going on in this administration? Where's the national defense review? Where's the national weapon review? Unsure. We don't know. Funnily enough, the administration did allow the publication of this. This is the intelligence community's annual threat assessment, which is done typically every year at the beginning of the budget cycle. So the administration is informed and the Congress is informed by the intelligence community. What are the threats we are facing here in the United States? Well, this came out in March, sort of right on time. And the administration didn't seem to block it. And it goes well beyond what the national security strategy addresses. So is there a disconnect here between what the intelligence community thinks is problematic for the United States and what the administration is willing to focus on? We'll find out. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. So now, could you walk us through what you think are the salient points in this strategy that we need to know about?
I will try. The themes you want to keep in mind are the ones that Maureen started with. This didn't happen overnight. I think the best way to understand this is that it is this document, National Security Strategy, it is the ratification of changes in the American voter outlook that's taken place basically since Vietnam. You'll see if you read this, that this is the first time you'll see in print a lot of the political changes that we've been dealing with summarized in a single document. And I hope that the historians among you in the audience will forgive my 3-minute synopsis of the 20th century. But there was a buildup to these changes. World War II accelerated the collapse of colonial empires, kings, and the economies of much of the world. Only the US, among major industrial democracies, escaped damage to its infrastructure and civilian society. Two nuclear-armed geopolitical spheres squared off for a Cold War, but neither one wanted a nuclear war. And our strategy to contain communism was to use conventional force if necessary, but to avoid direct combat with nuclear powers. You're still seeing that. This led to the creation of NATO and CETO. It also entailed some 50 proxy wars. Korea, Vietnam, the Congo Wars, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan are examples, but there are many more. East-West conflicts, Cold War conflicts. Secondly, we sought to avoid future global conflicts by creating interdependencies between nations. This led to the creation of the rules-based world order, and also derided as globalization, from which would emerge the United Nations, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and numerous transnational organizations. You might be surprised, but these strategies worked. There has been no nuclear war. Instead, we've had strategic arms reductions. Conquest gave way to economic sanctions, and fewer people died in international conflicts. Between 2004 and 2014, for example, there were fewer than 160,000 battlefield deaths across state borders. And that trend ended with Gaza and Ukraine. Over the years, war-devastated economies have prospered, developing nations have raised living standards, world poverty is down, and world health is up. The greatest beneficiary of globalization has been the United States, which has seen trillions of dollars added to its GDP. This view graph shows the US GDP growth accelerating since the 1950s toward $27 trillion in 2024. In 2022, GDP rose by $7,800 per person. In addition, lower consumer prices for goods have benefited every household. But there have been costs for these achievements. First, our military forces have been in almost continuous combat since World War II, with the attendant loss of life, economic costs, and the disruption of society. Second, the fruits of globalization have not been distributed equitably. Stockholders and the wealthy have gained at the expense of the middle and working classes, which have hollowed out as income disparities grew. Jobs were exported to lower wage areas, and our economy changed shape. This view graph shows that manufacturing accounted for some 30% of our economy and 3 out of 10 jobs in the 1950s. Today, that figure is about 8% and 1 out of 12 jobs. And today, our economy is about 80% services. Not all of this change is a result of globalization. Computer-based developments have led to productivity gains, which reduced demands for labor. Container shipping allowed the efficient organization of supply chains, and anti-union sentiment weakened job protections. By the 1980s, rising income inequality became a political as well as an economic issue, and you might recall candidate Bill Clinton declaring that the economy is stupid. Voter resentment over job losses, income disparities, and the cost of providing security to once devastated nations that have grown strong and now compete with us has come to a head. No more military interventions, no more forever wars, no more world's policemen, no more open borders, and no more corporate offshoring without regard for the workers. Voter confidence in their government is at an all-time low, and these themes now appear explicitly and implicitly in this national security strategy. You are aware that the world around us is once again slowly morphing into geopolitical spheres. One is centered in China, a weak but ambitious Russia, and a volatile North Korea. The other one is centered in the US, Western plus Eastern Europe, and Japan. Let's look at some of the power levers with which the national security strategy proposes to deal with this evolving world. The first lever is military power, which is to be used judiciously and with a predisposition to non-intervention, although current events are hard to square with this. In a sense, a committee wrote this report, but the president doesn't feel bound by it. The U.S. military is touted as the strongest military in the world, a boast with which I agree. It is comprised of effective nuclear weapons and high-tech conventional weapons. It has the world's best command and control system, which allows forward troops to see enemy formations on their laptops using feeds from satellites and drones. It's true that drones have changed the nature of warfare and eroded the values of armored and naval forces, but experience with them and plans to deal with them are high on the agenda of all military planners. What has put the U.S. military in a class by itself is its unique power to project forces to any point in the world, at least in years past. Military force projection rests on a powerful Navy and a powerful Air Force, which can control the seas and protect logistical lines of support. This depends in turn on the availability of major ports and airfields on the territories of allied nations near the conflict. But most of the stepping stones used in past conflicts have been lost since the end of the Cold War, and our ability to project power has atrophied by losing allies as well as bases. In the South China Sea, for example, the U.S. has lost all of its major bases. The nearest hub is on Okinawa. In the Philippines, Subic Bay and Clark Air Force Base were closed in 1992. Today, we have only a few small bases there for counterterrorism training. To make matters worse, China has developed extensive anti-ship missile defenses, which now command the entire South China Sea. Most of the missiles can be guided with satellite or radar sensors, and some have maneuvering or hypersonic reentry vehicles. In a war with China, surface ships like carrier task forces and freighters would likely face heavy losses. This makes the support of troops on the littoral problematic, the resupply of Taiwan unlikely, and the use of large surface naval forces risky. The loss of stepping stones and the introduction of advanced weapons are consistent with the reordering of regional priorities in the NSS. We're downgrading Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. This can be seen as backing away from hotspots likely to put us on a collision path with nuclear powers. The new priorities are consistent with the president's declaration in an Atlantic magazine interview that he will decide what America first means. And with his New York Times interview that as commander-in-chief, he is constrained only by my own morality and not by international laws or treaties. A second lever is to achieve our national goals is using the dollar-based financial system, which dominates commercial relations across the globe. The dollar is the paramount international currency, and the U.S. is the world's largest economy. Dollar investments provide the main reserve for both private and state investors. The SWIFT exchange system smooths and expedites international transactions. The non-political posture of the Federal Reserve Bank inspires confidence. There's growing pressure against the dollar system, however, as it has been weaponized to apply sanctions against unfavored nations, and the Fed may lose its independence. Meanwhile, protectionism, industrial policies, and the Sino-US geopolitical competition are driving the world economy into trading blocks. Many countries chafe under the dollar system and are seeking an alternative. The most prominent effort to develop a counterweight to the dollar system is BRICS, an acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, although other nations are involved. Collectively, BRICS comprises more than a quarter of the global economy and nearly half of the world's population. For now, the dollar remains dominant. It has deep liquidity and trust, but the trends shown in this chart are ominous. The future always looks distant until it isn't.
Thank you, Ray. A sobering, I should say, look at the strategy. So now I'm going to ask our two speakers to give us a little bit of wrap up. First, Ray, a little bit of summary of what you think are the key takeaways. And then I'm going to ask Keith to give us the, what does this mean, right? What are the implications for the future? Moving forward and backward and standing still, we will start with Ray.
All right. Well, overall, I think when you read the National Security Strategy, it sees us entering a new world with new strong players who will continue to avoid direct military conflict if possible. And to facilitate this, we will try to reduce our military presence and obligations in contested areas and turn toward economic competition. The Trump overlay, I think, is that strong nations will determine the international order, and worldwide security commitments of the past are going to become vague and depend on circumstances. Economic competition is going to be run by a transactional approach rather than a rules-based approach that we've seen embraced by an increasingly enfeebled international order. Decisions will be made by the leaders of sovereign nations, and it will be an era of power over principle. It calls to mind, to me, a timeless quote from Hamlet. There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. We're now relativists, but to progress, we must get our house in order. A nation that cannot make a decision can neither lead nor prosper.
Wow. Thank you for that summary, Ray. That was also sobering, I might add.
Happy wording, yeah.
So Keith, what does all this mean?
Have a nice day. There are 5 things I kind of want to highlight, I think, in conclusion. One is agenda versus strategy. This document doesn't give us any policies to achieve what the administration wants. As I said, it's more like a campaign speech. And this is not just true in national security, it's true in domestic foreign policies as well. This administration so far has been very inarticulate in terms of giving a rational explanation for what it wants to do. It just does it. It's action. And these decisions and actions are taken absent real policy explanations and national debate. Things just kind of happen. The gutting of AID, the Agency for International Development, unilateral action against Venezuela, the desire to control Greenland. Look, I'm Danish. I don't like that. Initiatives to solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem. Well, maybe some good will come out of that. How about the strategic strikes against Iran's nuclear weapons facilities? Maybe that was positive, but it just kind of happens. There have been a clear discounting and a disregard for previous national security expertise and experience. A very damning of the elites that this document says have led us astray over the last decades. Now, we have midterm elections coming up in about a year. So this administration really has 2 years when it controls Congress, both houses, and can kind of do what it wants to do without opposition, at least significant opposition. But guess what? As typically happens politically in the United States, In another year or so, this administration is going to lose control of one or both of the houses of Congress. And then what do we have? It'll be an interesting ride. What about our nuclear policy? Nuclear weapons remain, even though it's not articulated in this strategy as it was in previous ones, remain the bedrock of our national deterrence and defense. Modernization is absolutely required, and it's absolutely expensive. Both legs of the triad, the nuclear-equipped submarines, the nuclear-equipped aircraft, and what else? Yes. Where is strategic stability in all this? Previous administrations thought it pretty wise to try to cap the competition through nuclear arms control agreements, rather than just trying to build endlessly to have more than the other guy. In fact, in the late 60s, both the United States and the Soviet Union decided that was a pointless endeavor. Let's get some boundaries here so we're not just wasting money trying to outdo each other. There has been no effort that I have seen, and I would like to have somebody correct me on this, to continue the New START treaty provisions. Provisions for capping the size of our nuclear weapons, strategic nuclear weapon forces, and the many verification provisions that we created over the last 50 years so that we could live with each other without having to worry about the bomb. So we risk at this point losing 50 years of hard work and expertise and accomplishment to provide some strategic stability to this world, which could easily get out of control. So my hope is for more clarity over the next year, for sure. What's the policy to deal with North Korea? Still out there, still a threat. Are we going to see a national defense strategy? Are we going to see a new nuclear weapons posture statement, reassuring our country that we know how to handle and manage our strategic nuclear weapons so that they provide deterrence and not destruction? And what about soft power? What about diplomacy? What about international aid that have been tools that we have used along with military force to try to make the world a safer place for us to exist? Silence is what we have. The national security strategy mentions soft power without any explanation of what it means or its importance. So these to me are the concerns that I have based on what we know to date. And obviously in the future, we're going to learn more, but hopefully there'll be more serious debate to try to make sure that good decisions are made that have lasting value and don't just meet an immediate whim to solve a problem which maybe has longer lasting tail to it. So that's all I can say. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Keith. So that tells us a little bit of what the strategy, what the implications are of the strategy, what things we have to pay attention to. And as Keith pointed out very eloquently, the issue of arms control and strategic nuclear deterrence will be on our minds come next month as the last remaining treaty with Russia, nuclear arms treaty with Russia expires. So we are watch this space, and yes, this is a future program we will be looking at. Let's go back. I've got a couple great questions here, and I'm going to start and turn to you, Ray, first, because you made the statement in your talk about we have the world's best military. And we have the world's best military, most powerful command and control. How do we know that's true? I mean, obviously, going into Venezuela and capturing Maduro was a demonstration of strength. But what do we really know about big adversaries? What do we know about places like China if we were to go up against them? And can we consistently say this is the world's best military?
Leave out consistency. But yes, we have the world's best military, and I'll argue a couple of reasons for that. But let me answer the second question first. The way you find out is by going to war. Where you go to war will weigh heavily on who has the best military, because it depends on where you're fighting. So we'll back up. Basically, the U.S. has been fighting continuously. It has been the only superpower military that's been in that situation. The last time the Russians fought were in engagements in Georgia and former satellite countries, and it was bloody. You saw them try to invade Kiev. Poor tactics, poor command and control, poor discipline, poor training, poor equipment. They lost half their tanks in the march on Kiev, and in the fight subsequent to that, you've seen them take almost 1 million casualties in the fight against a much smaller adversary. And one of their biggest problems is that they don't use joint maneuvers very well, anyhow. They tend to use, I won't even call them World War II tactics. They go back to the charge of the Light Brigade and the way they use troops against entrenched positions and so forth. So that they were not experienced after the fall of the Soviet Empire. Their military hollowed out. Our military did not. But we have a different problem. Today, we have the most advanced equipment. Whenever we get into fights, small fights even, and Venezuela, you saw it in the newsreels, they were in and out through heavy defenses. They jammed the Russians, one of the Russians' most recent air defense systems, the S-300. Russians have an S-400, but the Venezuelans had an S-300 system deployed around Caracas. They flew right through it. And they're good at that. They're good at that. Command and control had special forces inside the presidential palace and out in a matter of minutes. And then there are a lot of things we can't talk about, like the Navy and the submarine capabilities and our ability for hunter-killer submarines and that sort of thing. That's off the table. You can't discuss that. But the Chinese Navy, for example, is going to be built up. You're reading a lot about the numbers that they have. Let me tell you something about the quality that they have. Their first aircraft carrier was the sister ship of a Russian aircraft carrier, the Komsomolsk, and the Chinese bought it. The Komsomolsk was the aircraft carrier that the Russians sent to the Mediterranean about 4 years ago for a show of force, and it broke down and had to be towed to port. Okay. The Chinese are building their second aircraft carrier. We started building aircraft carriers in the 20s. It takes more than one try to get it right. So, without going into great details, I will simply assert that the quality of our Navy is better, but that it depends on where our Navy has to fight. If we try to fight with carrier task forces in the South China Sea, we will lose them. We do not want to fight China with conventional weapons or nuclear weapons, but we don't want to fight China. It's a wise decision to change this relationship to an economic competition, because we are poorly equipped to fight China when they have so many anti-ship missiles, and most of our force projection is with surface ships in that area. So I would argue that we do have the best military. The only way to prove this is go to war with somebody. But every time we've used it, we've come out on top. You go back to Desert Storm. Iraq at the time was the third largest military in the world. All right. 8 days. 8 days. Poof. And well, the intervention in Serbia doesn't really count. But where we've used our military, we've defeated huge military forces in a matter of days. And it's superior equipment, superior tactics, superior training, superior command and control. And what happens is that U.S. forces come out of nowhere and suddenly the enemy is crippled. I will go on this.
Thank you. Well, you made your point. And I think one of the things, I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to go for a question for Keith first, but I'm going to come back to you and ask, how many of these conflicts can we sustain at the same time? But think on that while I turn to Keith. And I pulled a thread from some of the things, Keith, that you finished your thoughts on, which is, how do we survive? How does the country survive? How does it move forward? You talked about we're in another situation now. We're moving into election season. We have midterm elections. Things may change in the Congress. How are we resilient in the face of an administration that seems unbound by laws and norms?
I think our biggest problem is that we have a leadership crisis in this country. I don't care what side of the aisle you look at. Where are the strong, experienced, wise leaders who can come into future administrations and help direct the future of this country? That's where I think we're weak. We don't have much depth. And I fear for us because, yes, in the past, we've always made it through. No administration has brought our country down to its knees, but we always have seemed to have had a fairly strong backbench of potential leaders who had the experience, the wisdom to lead forward. That's where I think we're really vulnerable.
Thank you for that point. And I think we will drill down on that some more. But let me go back to Ray. Give us your thought, and in the context, two questions that I'm going to pose to you at the same time. One is what I just said, which is, how many of these little hotspot fires can we sustain with our military force that we have? And the second is, are we losing, what happens when the American population starts to lose trust in the military because of deployments domestically?
Well, first, how many conflicts can you handle? I mean, the answer to that always is, it depends. It depends how big the enemy forces are. It depends on where they are. Where they are, I mean, you can't lose sight of this. War is all about geography. And where the war is determines a lot about the balance of power. But the short and sweet of it is, as long as they're small, we can handle quite a few. And as long as they're nearby, we can handle them all. But if they're in Tibet, we've got a serious problem, no matter how good our military is, because we can't get there and we can't sustain there. What was the second one?
What happens when the American population, if the American population loses its confidence or its support for the military because of domestic deployments? That's sorry, yeah, that was a loaded question.
Yeah, well, you all have your own answers for that. My outlook is that the American public is not mad at the U.S. military. They're ordered into these situations, and most of it is short-lived. And they're not the ones that are going around in mass whacking people in crowds. They're simply guarding facilities and so forth. I don't think that you're going to have early anger. There may be some people who just don't like the military, but there always have been. But I don't think this is a problem in I'm going to say the next couple of years. I don't think that's a problem. That's not an immediate problem, I don't think.
Excellent. Thank you. I appreciate that. And that's good, because a lot of people in this room remember when the military became the focus of anger, not the administration deploying it. So if we're in a position where that isn't in the near term, that's probably a positive thing for all of us.
That was during the draft.
Right. And that was during the draft. Right, exactly. So Keith, you mentioned when you talked about what's the same and what's different and the focus on the Western Hemisphere, you talked a lot about the focus on migration. How much of a factor is the movement of people going to be in either contributing to this administration's strategy or their reaction? And that movement of people could be driven by economic forces, but it's certainly still being driven by climate forces. Do you see that as a near-term issue that could cause disruption that we have to respond to?
My sense is that a lot of the support for this administration and for this president is because of the mass migration issue. They certainly have hyped it, but I think it's a real one. Nevertheless, it didn't just happen in the last couple of years. This has been happening for some time. And you look at the state of California. I'm a native Californian, and I see my state going down the tubes because it's trying to support people who don't support the state. And if you keep having people come in who are mooching off of everybody else's contributions to the welfare, how long can you sustain that? I mean, this is ripe for a revolution, frankly, eventually. And I think a lot of what we see in people in Montana, Idaho, and other people, they've checked out and they have their guns. They're waiting for Washington to collapse. They're going to maintain peace and quiet in their own homestead. I mean, we're sort of getting to that point. Some people are getting quite desperate and quite concerned that the stability of this country is on the ropes.
Well, speaking for the people of Montana, we also have eagles, so that's a good thing. But there is something to be said for that. Rural America, I find living in rural America to be a wake-up call. The situation is challenging. The economic situation is incredibly challenging. And I get grounding when I go home to deep red Montana, but I live on a tribal reservation, about the challenges that people are facing and where a lot of this anger in the country is coming from. But speaking of finances, right, I'm going to pivot to you because you were the one who introduced the concept of the economic issues being a driver, not only of the strategy, but of what this administration is doing. So there's been a lot of talk in the last 24 hours, in particular, about the dump US strategy. So we talked about our financial systems being a primary lever. We have a huge amount of debt. Why wouldn't countries who are feeling themselves on the pointy end of the stick right now, it may be a tariff stick, dump US assets en masse to show their levers in the situation?
Yes. I think the first thing to realize is that people are dumping US assets and they're moving into Euro and other kinds of havens. But it's not so pronounced that it's rocked the system. But we have some things going on that will rock the system. When you step back and look at the problems we're causing with the European public by criticizing European leaders and indeed European civilization, there's talk now about simply giving up on America and basically reacting by withdrawing in, well, European and Eurobloc relations with America. Now, think of what happens if that really occurs. You find that the Western financial leverage that everybody's talking about is comprised half of Europe. It's half ours, it's half Europe's. Europe is, the second richest place in the world in terms of the size and per capita and that sort of thing. Consumers, they have a steady euro currency. They have the ability to become a trading sphere and to break away from the US geopolitical sphere. And when we exacerbate public feelings to the point that political leaders have to react to them, we're entering into very swampy ground. Add to that politicizing of the Federal Reserve Bank, and you have another reason to hedge against deposits in dollar-denoted treasuries. So I think it's a serious problem. It's going on now. It's already started. You have BRICS trying to actually create a formal counterweight. The good news is that there are so many of these independent nations that they can't agree among themselves, which is what has fundamentally delayed the development of a counterweight. They just can't get it together. But I don't know how long that's going to last.
Right. So we have challenges in the military and we have challenges in the economics. Right. Keith, you are excused. So with that, I'm just going to close our program. Keith, do you have one? Come back.
By definition.
Give us your 1 minute, right?
Yes.
1 minute synopsis on where we go from here. How do the people in this room think about what's happening from this strategy and from this administration, what should they be paying attention to, and where do we go from here? In a minute. 45 seconds now, because I took up 15.
Vote wisely.
Okay. Ray, I asked you the same question.
Well, as usual, I have something cheerful to say. And that is that we are in a cultural revolution right now. Both of our parties have collapsed. And neither of our parties has a good vision of who they are and what they want to become. And we are going to be in this situation, I think, for more than a decade until the political system responds to the changes in voter outlook that we've all experienced and find some way to reconstruct the political tents, which in effect provide the political planks where you vote one way or another. I mean, you never know what you're going to get, but you know there's a tendency on one side, tendency on the other. But candidates are not going to have parties really to enforce policies for them until things settle down. And we are in the area of a consolidated executive, some of which we needed. And the question is, where will this pendulum stop? And where will, in effect, these huge political changes that we're undergoing settle down so that we do have definable political groups? And my bet is we won't answer this question for this decade.
So on that note, I encourage everybody in the room to bring the next generation with them, because I think what you're saying, Ray, is we're passing the torch from those of us.
We're passé.
Passing the torch to the next generations. For people here, please bring the younger folks. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being back at NSF. It was a delight to see everybody. If you have topics that you want us to consider in this new venue and our new format, please let me know. I'm always available. Have a wonderful day and be safe.
Thank you.